The package arrived on a Tuesday, a plain brown cube that gave no hint of the unease it would soon unpack onto my cluttered kitchen counter. The shipping label was crisp, the tape excessive, as if the sender feared the contents might stage a rebellion and push their way out before reaching their destination. I'd found her on a niche auction site dedicated to the odd and the antique, a place where history was both a selling point and a ghost that lingered in the seams of objects. Her listing was a single, slightly blurred photograph. She was a composition doll from, I guessed, the 1920s, with a porcelain head and a cloth body that had faded from a probable cream to a jaundiced yellow. Her hair was a shock of mohair, the color of burnt caramel, swooped into an intricate style that had long since begun to unravel. But it was her face that had captivated me, that had made me place a bid without a second thought. Her painted features were exquisite, two delicate brows arched in perpetual surprise, tiny red lips pursed as if about to whisper a secret, and cheeks blushed with a faint rosy hue. And her eyes, they were glass, a deep liquid blue, and they held a startlingly lifelike depth. They seemed to look not at the camera, but through it, holding a knowledge that felt both ancient and unsettling. I named her Clarissa before she even arrived. The winning bid was surprisingly low, as if other collectors had been subtly deterred. The seller's username was simply Curio Cabinet, and their communication was terse, limited to a single message confirming the payment had been received. There was no thank you, no hope you enjoy your item, just a digital receipt and a tracking number. Now, with the box in front of me, I felt a thrill of anticipation. I used my keys to slice through the thick tape, the sound unnaturally loud in my quiet apartment. Inside, nestled within a nest of yellowed packing paper that smelled faintly of cedar and dust, lay Clarissa. She was even more beautiful in person, her porcelain cool and smooth under my tentative fingertips. I lifted her out, careful to support her head. She was heavier than I expected, her presence substantial. I set her gently on the counter and reached back into the box for the rest of the packing paper, assuming my unboxing was complete. My fingers brushed against a single thick piece of cardstock tucked at the very bottom. I pulled it out. It was an index card, the kind used for old library catalogs, its edges soft with age. On it, in a spidery, precise script written with what looked like a fountain pen, was a list. Not a note of appreciation. Not a certificate of authenticity. Instructions. Do not place her in a room with reflective surfaces. Cover any mirrors or glass cabinets. I blinked, reading the line again. A slow, incredulous smile spread across my face. What an odd, theatrical touch. The seller clearly had a flair for the dramatic, a desire to imbue this old doll with a spooky provenance to increase her value, or perhaps just for their own amusement. It was charming, in a kitschy Halloween kind of way. I read on. Between the hours of 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. you must ensure you are awake. You must be able to hear her. My smile faltered slightly. Hear her? The instruction was so specific, so bizarre. Free. If you hear her whispering, you must not answer, do not speak to her, do not acknowledge the sound in any way. A faint prickle, cold and unwelcome, traced a path down my spine. The earnestness of the prose was unsettling. There was no winking emoji, no hint of irony in that meticulous handwriting. She enjoys music. Play the radio for her for 1 hour each day. Classical music is preferred, it keeps her calm. Never, under any circumstances, leave her alone in a dark room. A small nightlight must be provided at all times. 6. Do not give her a name. If you have already done so, cease using it immediately. That one hit me like a small, cold stone in my stomach. I had already named her. The name Clarissa echoed in my mind, feeling suddenly foolish and dangerous. I shook my head, physically trying to dislodge the creeping sense of unease. This was ridiculous. I was a rational adult, a graphic designer who lived in a world of pixels and logic, not ghost stories and haunted dolls. This was just an eccentricity, a bit of fun. I crumpled the cardstock in my hand, intending to toss it in the recycling, but my hand hesitated mid-air. Something about the absolute seriousness of the words made me pause. With a sigh of self-irritation, I smoothed the card out again and tucked it into a kitchen drawer, shoving it behind the tea towels. Out of sight, out of mind. I turned my attention back to Clarissa. She needed a proper place, a spot of honor. My apartment was small, but I had a lovely glass-fronted bookcase in the living room where I displayed my favorite curiosities, a taxidermy hummingbird, a collection of antique keys, a few first-edition books. The top shelf was perfect. I cleared a space, moving a small geode to the side, and placed her there, arranging her so she sat primly, her little porcelain hands resting on her knees. She looked magnificent there, a perfect silent queen overlooking her domain. Her blue glass eyes seemed to follow me as I moved around the room, but that was just a trick of the light, a common phenomenon with old dolls. I deliberately did not cover the glass door of the bookcase. I left her there as I went about my evening, making dinner, answering emails, trying to forget the strange list in the drawer. But my eyes kept drifting back to her. Every time I entered the living room, I felt the subtle pull of her gaze. It was just my imagination, fueled by the seller's silly instructions. I was anthropomorphizing an inanimate object, nothing more. Night fell. I watched television, the blue light flickering through the dark room. Clarissa was a dark silhouette on her shelf, her features swallowed by the shadow. I caught myself glancing at her more and more, a nervous habit I couldn't seem to break. When I finally went to bed, I left the living room in darkness. I deliberately did not plug in a nightlight. I fell into a fitful sleep, my dreams fragmented and strange, filled with the sound of whispering I couldn't quite understand. A sound jolted me awake. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic drum in the utter silence of the night. The digital clock on my bedside table glowed a toxic green, 3:17 a.m. I held my breath, straining my ears. What had woken me? The old building creaked, settling into its bones as it did every night. A car alarm warbled faintly from a few streets over. Then I heard it. It was the faintest of sounds, a dry, rustling whisper, like pages of a book being turned by a weak wind. It was coming from the living room. "It's the packing paper," I told myself, my mind scrambling for a rational anchor. "It's just settling in the box." But the box was in the kitchen. This sound was different. It was rhythmic, intentional. It sounded like words. I lay frozen, the seller's instructions screaming in my memory. "You must be able to hear her. If you hear her whispering, you must not answer." This was insane. It was the wind, or the pipes, or my own sleep-addled brain manufacturing sounds in the silence. The whispering stopped. The silence that followed was somehow heavier, more profound, as if the entire apartment was holding its breath. And then, a new sound. A faint, melodic humming. It was a tune I didn't recognize, a meandering, discordant series of notes that felt both old and profoundly sad. It was coming from the bookcase. Terror, cold and absolute, locked my limbs to the bed. Every rational thought, every ounce of adult reasoning evaporated. I was pure, primal fear. The humming continued for what felt like an eternity, a lullaby meant for something that never slept. And then, it too faded away. The clock read 3:58 a.m. The designated hour was nearly over. I didn't move until the first gray light of dawn filtered through my blinds. My body was stiff with tension. I crept out of bed, my every sense screaming in alarm. The living room was exactly as I had left it. The bookcase stood silent. Clarissa sat exactly where I had placed her, her pose unchanged, but her head was tilted ever so slightly to the side, as if she were listening for something, or as if she had moved during the night. I stood there, wrapped in a blanket, staring at her. The bright morning light made the previous night's terror seem distant and silly. It was a dream, a hypnagogic hallucination. It had to be. But the memory of that whispering, that hauntingly off-key humming, was etched into my mind with terrifying clarity. I thought about the instructions. I had broken nearly every one. I had placed her in front of a glass cabinet. I had left her in the dark. I had given her a name. And I had heard her. With a newfound trembling respect, I went to the kitchen drawer and pulled out the crumpled card. I smoothed it on the counter, reading each line as if it were a sacred text, a manual for survival. I had to fix this. I started with the bookcase. I found an old black scarf and draped it over the glass door, completely obscuring the view inside. It looked strange, a dark shroud in the middle of my bright living room, but the immediate sense of relief was palpable. It felt like I had just closed a pair of watching eyes. Next, I went to the store and bought a nightlight. Not a cute, cartoon-shaped one, but a simple utilitarian plug-in that emitted a soft, warm glow. I plugged it into the outlet right next to the bookcase, ensuring Clarissa would never be in total darkness again. I found an old portable radio in a closet, dug out a set of batteries and tuned it to the local classical station. The serene sounds of a violin concerto filled the room. I placed the radio on the shelf next to the shrouded bookcase and set a timer on my phone for 1 hour. "There," I said aloud, my voice sounding too loud in the apartment. "Classical music." I felt foolish, talking to a doll behind a curtain, but the instructions said it kept her calm. I needed calm. The day passed with a tense normality. I worked from home, the sound of the classical station a constant, soothing presence. Every so often, I would glance at the draped bookcase, half expecting to see the fabric moving. It never did. The real test would come at night. As 3 a.m. approached, a heavy dread settled in my stomach. I made a pot of strong coffee and sat on the sofa with a book, determined to stay awake, to follow the rules. The clock ticked over. 3 a.m. The apartment was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the frantic beating of my own heart. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. 3:15. Still nothing. 3:30. The tension was a physical weight on my chest. Had it been a one-time thing? Had my adherence to the rules somehow placated whoever was in there? And then it began. Not whispering this time. It was a soft, rhythmic sound. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was the sound of something small and hard being dragged across a rough surface. It was coming from inside the bookcase. It was the sound of porcelain fingers scraping slowly, deliberately across the wooden shelf. I sat rigid on the sofa, my book forgotten in my lap, my coffee gone cold. The sound was unmistakable and horrifying. It was a sound of movement, of agency. It was a sound that proved the thing behind the curtain was not inert. It was aware. The scratching continued for exactly 20 minutes. A slow, maddening torture. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The clock read 3:50 a.m. Silence descended, thicker and more menacing than before. I didn't move until well after 4 a.m., until the sky began to lighten and the spell of the witching hour was broken. Exhaustion pulled at me, but my mind was racing. This was real. The instructions were not a joke. They were a warning. A desperate set of rules to manage something incomprehensible. I spent the next day in a haze. The classical music played. The nightlight glowed. I avoided the living room as much as I could. My work suffered, my concentration shattered by the memory of that scratching sound. I needed to know more. I logged back onto the auction site and found the seller's profile. Curio cabinet? I sent a message, my fingers trembling on the keyboard. The doll arrived. I read the instructions. What happens if the rules are broken? What is she? The response was immediate, as if the seller had been waiting for my message. You have broken rules. It wasn't a question. A new wave of cold washed over me. How could they know? What happens? I typed back, desperation clawing at me. There was a long pause. 3 dancing dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, a new message came through. She gets stronger, and she gets hungry. Follow the instructions. Do not write to me again. The account was deleted before I could even finish reading the message. The profile page vanished into a 404 error. I was alone. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat on the sofa, the lights on, staring at the black draped bookcase like a sentinel. The radio played its gentle music. The nightlight cast its feeble glow. The clock ticked slowly, agonizingly toward 3 a.m. I had followed all the instructions today. I had done everything right. But the seller's words echoed in my mind. She gets stronger. At 3:05 a.m. the whispering began again. It was louder this time, less like rustling paper and more like a true voice, though it was still too faint and distorted to make out words. It was a sibilant, urgent hiss from behind the curtain. I clenched my fists, digging my nails into my palms, focusing on the pain to keep from screaming. Do not answer. The whispering grew more intense, more desperate. It sounded like it was right against the fabric of the scarf, as if the speaker was just on the other side of the glass. Then, a new sound. A faint tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was the sound of small, hard fingertips knocking gently on the glass door of the bookcase. She was trying to get out. The whispering and the tapping continued in a horrifying duet. I squeezed my eyes shut, tears of terror leaking down my cheeks. I couldn't do this. I couldn't live like this. The hour passed in a blur of sheer panic. When the sounds finally ceased at 4 a.m., I was drenched in a cold sweat, trembling uncontrollably. This was my life now. A life governed by the whims of a porcelain doll, a prisoner in my own home from 3 to 4 every morning. Days bled into a week. A routine of terror established itself. I played the music. I kept the light on. I stayed awake during the witching hour, listening to the sounds from the bookcase, the scratching, the whispering, the tapping. Each night the sounds seemed a little louder, a little closer, a little more deliberate. The thing inside was testing its boundaries, pushing against the rules that contained it. I stopped eating properly. I stopped seeing friends, making excuses about being sick. The world outside my apartment ceased to exist. My entire reality had shrunk to these 4 walls and the malevolent presence contained within them. I began to hate the doll with a passion that burned through my fear. This thing, this entity, had stolen my life, my peace, my sanity. One afternoon, fueled by a reckless rage born of sleep deprivation and despair, I stormed into the living room. I couldn't take it anymore. I was going to end this. I was going to destroy her. I yanked the black scarf off the bookcase. Clarissa sat there, as serene and beautiful as ever. Her blue eyes met mine, and in their glassy depths, I saw not innocence, but a cold, ancient mockery. My hand trembled as I reached for the latch on the glass door. I would grab her and smash her on the floor. I would reduce her to dust. But as my fingers touched the cool metal of the latch, I froze. The instruction card flashed in my mind. Do not leave her alone in a dark room. But it was the middle of the day. The sun was shining. The nightlight was plugged in. The radio was playing a cheerful Bach fugue. And yet a darkness seemed to be gathering inside the bookcase, a deep shadow that clung to Clarissa like a shroud. The temperature around the shelf plummeted. I could see my own breath forming in a faint mist in front of the glass. A single clear thought cut through the rage in my mind. This is what she wants. She wanted me to break. She wanted me to open the door, to let her out. With a cry of frustration and defeat, I stumbled backward, my courage deserting me. I fumbled for the black scarf and threw it back over the bookcase, hiding those knowing eyes from view. I sank to the floor, sobbing, utterly broken. I was trapped. That night the sounds were different. The whispering was clear enough that I could almost make out the words. It was my name. She was whispering my name, the name she was never supposed to know. Clarissa, the voice hissed, a dry, rustling sound that slithered under the curtain and across the room. Clarissa! It was followed by a soft, melodic laughter that was far more terrifying than any whisper could be. The tapping on the glass became more insistent, not a request anymore, but a demand. I curled into a ball on the sofa, my hands clamped over my ears, but it was useless. The sound was inside my head. I knew then that the rules were not containing her. They were only slowing her down. She was getting stronger, just as the seller had said. And soon the glass door and the night light and the classical music wouldn't be enough to hold her back. I had to get rid of her. But how? I couldn't touch her. I couldn't give her to someone else, passing this curse along like a poisoned heirloom. The auction site was gone. The seller had vanished. I was alone with my problem. The next morning, I formulated a desperate plan. I would package her up exactly as she had arrived. I would take her to the storage unit I rented on the outskirts of the city. I would leave her there, locked in a dark, silent box, buried behind old furniture and forgotten memories. She would be alone in the dark, breaking the most important rule, but she would be away from me. It was a risk, but I had no other choice. I waited until the sun was high in the sky, bolstering my nerves. I gathered the original box and the yellowed packing paper. I put on a pair of thick gardening gloves, unable to bear the thought of my skin touching her porcelain. With a deep, shuddering breath, I approached the bookcase. The radio was playing. The nightlight was on. I pulled the scarf away. Clarissa sat there. Nothing had changed. And yet, everything had. I unlatched the glass door. The air around the shelf was cold, biting through my sweater. My heart hammered against my ribs as I reached in. My gloved hand closed around her cloth body. She was ice cold, a deep, unnatural cold that seeped through the glove material and into my bones. As I lifted her, her head lolled back, and her glass eyes seemed to fix on me with a look of pure, undiluted hatred. A wave of nausea washed over me. I quickly, clumsily shoved her into the box, burying her in the packing paper. I sealed the box with 2 entire rolls of packing tape, entombing her within. The sense of relief was immediate and overwhelming. It felt like a pressure valve had been released in my apartment. For the first time in weeks, I took a full, deep breath. I loaded the box into the trunk of my car and drove across town to my storage unit. It was in a large, impersonal facility, a maze of identical orange doors under fluorescent lights. The air smelled of dust and concrete. I opened my unit, shoved the box deep inside behind an old armchair, and slammed the door shut, turning the key in the lock with a final, satisfying click. It was done. She was gone. That night, I slept. A deep, dreamless, glorious sleep untroubled by whispers or scratching. I woke up feeling like a new person. The sun streamed through the windows. The world had color again. I made coffee. I listened to my own music. I called a friend and made plans for lunch. I was free. The nightmare was over. A week passed in peaceful, normal bliss. I stopped jumping at every sound. I took the scarf off the bookcase and put the geode back in its place. I unplugged the nightlight. Life returned to its regular rhythm. It was on the 8th day that the package arrived. A plain brown cube, sitting on my welcome mat. The shipping label was crisp, the tape excessive. There was no return address. My blood ran cold. With trembling hands, I brought it inside. It couldn't be. It was the same size, the same weight. I used my keys to slice through the tape. Inside, nestled in a nest of yellowed packing paper that smelled of cedar and dust, lay Clarissa. Her porcelain face was smudged with dirt, her dress torn, but her painted smile was the same, a tiny, cruel red curve. and in her lap rested a new piece of cardstock. In the same spidery handwriting, a new instruction was written. "You cannot get rid of me. I am yours now. We will be together forever." And below that, a final, horrifying postscript. "I don't like the dark.